Critical Theory. Selected Essays by Max Horkheimer. Quotes. Critical Theory. Selected Essays by Max Horkheimer offers a profound exploration of the philosophical underpinnings and implications of critical theory, addressing themes of ideology, authoritarianism, and the role of philosophy in society. Horkheimer argues that philosophy must evolve beyond traditional theories that uphold existing structures and instead foster a critical approach aimed at exposing and challenging societal power dynamics and inequalities. The essays in this collection examine the influence of science, religion, family, and culture on individual and collective consciousness, highlighting the importance of dialectical thinking in understanding and transforming societal conditions. Horkheimer's work, pivotal to the Frankfurt School, reveals a deep commitment to social change and underscores the need for philosophy to serve as a force for liberation and enlightenment in an increasingly technocratic world. Quote 1. In the Marxist theory of society, science is regarded as one of man's productive powers. Science, from a Marxist perspective, is considered not just as a neutral body of knowledge, but as a productive force shaping society. Its development over time has directly influenced the advancement of industrial systems and the flexibility of human thinking. The achievements of science are accessible across different social classes and have had significant impacts on both material production and intellectual progress. Quote 2. The fact that science contributes to the social life process as a productive power and a means of production in no way legitimates a pragmatist theory of knowledge. While science has played a crucial role in shaping society, this does not justify the belief that knowledge should only be valued for its practical applications. The truth in science must not be judged by its utility alone. Knowledge must be pursued for its own sake, separate from social interests or utility, even though it inevitably interacts with societal processes. Quote 3. Society in its present form is unable to make effective use of the powers it has developed and the wealth it has amassed. Despite immense advancements in science and technology, modern society struggles to utilize its productive powers for the benefit of all. There is an imbalance between the potential offered by scientific development and its actual implementation in improving human life. This failure to capitalize on wealth and knowledge exacerbates social and economic crises. Quote 4. One way of hiding the real causes of the present crisis is to assign responsibility for it to precisely those forces which are working for the betterment of the human situation. And this means, above all, rational, scientific thinking. Rather than addressing the actual causes of societal crises, there is a tendency to scapegoat scientific and rational thinking, which should be aiding in human progress. This deflection serves to obscure the true structural issues within society, while simultaneously devaluing critical reason in favor of more abstract or emotional responses to the problems at hand. Quote 5. Science evaded its responsibility when faced with the problem of the social process as a whole. Science has historically fallen short by limiting itself to observing and classifying phenomena without critically engaging with broader social problems. By treating society as a static mechanism rather than recognizing its dynamic and transformative nature, scientific inquiry has often failed to address the deeper structural issues that drive historical change. Quote 6. Modern physics has in large measure overcome within its own field the deficiencies of the traditional method and has revised its critical foundations. In response to its internal crisis, modern physics has adapted by refining its methods and addressing the shortcomings of traditional mechanistic approaches. This shift in critical foundations has allowed for a more nuanced understanding of phenomena, which marks progress within the discipline, even as broader metaphysical discussions challenge the role of science. Quote 7. Not only metaphysics, but the science it criticizes is ideological, insofar as the latter retains a form which hinders it in discovering the real causes of the crisis. Both metaphysics and science, though often seen as oppositional, are ideological when they fail to uncover the true nature of society's contradictions. Science, in particular, can become ideological if its methods and focus limit its ability to understand social realities. Ideology in this sense is not a deliberate distortion, but a consequence of the forms science takes within its social context. Quote 8. At the present time, scientific effort mirrors an economy filled with contradictions. The contradictions within the economy are reflected in the contradictions of scientific endeavor. Despite technological and scientific advancements, both remain constrained by social and economic forces. Science, like the economy, faces problems in setting its own direction and priorities, often failing to grasp its larger connection to the societal process that both drives and limits it. Quote 9. Insofar as we can rightly speak of a crisis in science, that crisis is inseparable from the general crisis. The crisis in science cannot be understood in isolation. It is deeply connected to the broader social and economic crises facing society. Science, as a productive force, is shaped by the limitations and contradictions of the historical moment. Therefore, a true understanding of science's crisis requires a proper analysis of the societal conditions that influence it. Quote 10. The idea of unbroken harmony between reality and reason belongs to the liberalist phase. In this statement, the concept of a natural harmony between reason and reality is identified as a key feature of bourgeois liberalism. During this period, individual interests were seen as harmonizing within the economy, suggesting that societal functions operated smoothly without major conflicts. However, this harmony was an illusion, and as historical changes occurred, the inherent contradictions of society became more visible. The shift from individual entrepreneurs to monopolistic power groups changed the philosophical categories used to describe history, emphasizing conflict rather than harmony. Quote 11. All the attitudes, representations, efforts, and thoughts that have arisen in the minds of men as they attempt to comprehend the world in its totality cannot be pure illusion. This quote highlights the persistence and recurrence of metaphysical ideas throughout history. Although some ideas may be deemed illogical or deceptive, they are not entirely meaningless. These notions reflect humanity's enduring effort to make sense of the world, expressing deep truths about the human condition. These metaphysical constructs serve as significant historical and cultural expressions, even if they no longer hold absolute truth. Quote 12. Materialism is thus reduced to the simple claim that only matter and its movements are real. In this passage, materialism is portrayed in its simplest form, reducing all phenomena to matter and physical processes. This understanding of materialism has been challenged for being overly simplistic, particularly when it comes to explaining consciousness and spiritual phenomena. The dismissal of materialism as an explanation for spiritual experiences reflects the philosophical debate over whether material processes alone can account for the complexity of human consciousness. Quote 13. The metaphysician thus believes that in the being he seeks to discover a basis may be found for shaping the individual's life. Metaphysics is characterized here as a quest for ultimate truths that can guide individual conduct. The metaphysician seeks to align life with the perceived order of the universe, finding ethical guidance in this alignment. This belief is rooted in theological traditions where divine will prescribes human behavior. Even in secular metaphysics, there is often an implicit expectation that understanding reality will provide a foundation for how one ought to live. Quote 14. Today the effort is made to demonstrate that the absolute demand is not necessarily connected with acceptance of an absolute consciousness by showing descriptively how the aspect of obligation is present in the phenomena themselves if we penetrate deeply enough into them. This quote refers to contemporary attempts to find moral or ethical imperatives without relying on a belief in an absolute or divine consciousness. Philosophers try to show that obligations can be inherent in phenomena when examined closely. This shift represents a movement away from metaphysical systems that depend on transcendent sources of morality, and toward an understanding of ethics grounded in observable reality. Quote 15. For the materialist, judgments which embrace all reality are always questionable and not very important, because far removed from the kind of activity which generated them. This quote reflects the materialist's skepticism toward sweeping metaphysical judgments that claim to explain all of reality. From the materialist's perspective, such broad statements are of little relevance because they are disconnected from the practical concerns and activities that give rise to more concrete knowledge. Materialism, in this view, prioritizes practical and situational understanding over abstract, all-encompassing theories. Quote 16. Today, the knowledge of movements and tendencies affecting society as a whole is immensely important for materialist theory. But in the 18th century, the problem of the social totality was overshadowed by questions of knowledge theory, of natural science, and of politics. This passage emphasizes the evolution of materialist theory over time. In the 18th century, materialism focused more on epistemological and political questions rather than the broader social dynamics that are now central to its concerns. As society has changed, materialism has shifted its attention to understanding social processes and totalities, reflecting its adaptive nature in response to historical developments. Quote 17. The materialist tries to replace the justification of action with an explanation of it through an historical understanding of the agent. This statement emphasizes that materialism seeks to explain human actions through historical context, rather than justifying them based on abstract principles. Materialists view justifications as illusions, preferring to understand behaviors as products of social and historical forces. This approach contrasts with idealism, which often seeks to ground moral actions in a higher, transcendent order. Materialism focuses on explaining the conditions that shape human behavior, particularly in societies marked by inequality and deprivation. Quote 18. When the desire for happiness, which life from beginning to end proves illusory, was put aside and hope alone was left, the alteration of those conditions which cause unhappiness could become the goal of materialist thought. Here, the shift in materialist thought is outlined. Once happiness is recognized as an unattainable illusion in the existing social order, the focus shifts to changing the very conditions that produce unhappiness. This change in focus reflects the historical and social contexts that shape materialism's goals. While earlier materialists focused on personal peace, the modern materialist is concerned with societal transformation, aiming to address the root causes of suffering within the social structure. Quote 19. The materialist's views are essentially determined by the tasks to be mastered at the moment. Materialism, as this quote suggests, is grounded in the practical and immediate needs of its time. Unlike idealism, which aims to answer eternal questions about existence, materialism adapts its theories and actions based on the problems faced in the present. It is not interested in abstract, timeless truths, but in finding solutions to concrete, historical challenges. This pragmatic approach allows materialism to remain flexible and relevant as social conditions evolve. Quote 20. Society, on which man's existence partially depends, is a totality which cannot be compared to anything else and is continuously restructuring itself. This quote stresses that society is a dynamic and ever-changing totality. Materialism recognizes that human existence is shaped by social conditions, which are not fixed but constantly evolving. Unlike metaphysical systems that seek to find static, timeless principles governing human life, materialism emphasizes the fluid and historically contingent nature of social structures, which require continuous adaptation and understanding. Quote 21. For all the optimism he has about changing situations, for all that he treasures the happiness which comes from solidarity among men and work for a changed society, he has a pessimistic streak as well. This passage highlights the dual nature of the materialist's outlook. On one hand, materialism is optimistic about the possibility of societal change and the potential for human solidarity to create a better world. On the other hand, it retains a pessimism rooted in the recognition that past injustices can never be fully rectified. This pessimism is not about future prospects, as in idealist fatalism, but about the irrevocable suffering and wrongs that have already occurred in history. Quote 22. Materialism, on the contrary, maintains the irreducible tension between concept and object, and thus has a critical weapon of defense against belief in the infinity of the mind. Materialism asserts that there is always a gap between human concepts and the reality they attempt to describe. This tension is seen as a safeguard against the idealist notion that the mind can achieve absolute perfect knowledge of the world. For the materialist, knowledge is always partial and conditioned by historical and social contexts, and it cannot fully encompass the totality of being or reduce reality to mere ideas. Quote 23. Materialism is not interested in a worldview or in the souls of men. It is concerned with changing the concrete conditions under which men suffer, and in which, of course, their souls must become stunted. This quote encapsulates the practical, action-oriented nature of materialism. Rather than focusing on abstract philosophical concerns about the nature of the soul, or constructing grand metaphysical systems, materialism is concerned with addressing the real, material conditions that cause human suffering. It seeks to transform the social and economic structures that deform human lives, aiming for tangible improvements in the human condition rather than speculative contemplation. Quote 24. Materialism requires the unification of philosophy and science. Materialism calls for the integration of philosophical thought and scientific inquiry. It rejects the idealist distinction between the two, insisting that philosophy must be grounded in the material realities of the world as understood through science. However, materialism also critiques the limitations of contemporary scientific practices, recognizing that science, shaped by current social conditions, is not free from its own ideological distortions. The ultimate aim is a holistic understanding of reality that incorporates both philosophical insights and scientific rigor. Quote 25. Materialism is not tied down to a set conception of matter. No authority has a say on what matter is, except natural science as it moves forward. This quote emphasizes that materialism is not static or dogmatic in its understanding of matter. Rather, it evolves along with scientific advancements. Materialism views knowledge as provisional, shaped by historical and social contexts, and open to revision as science progresses. Unlike rigid metaphysical systems, it recognizes that future discoveries may challenge or reshape current understanding, maintaining a flexible, science-driven perspective on reality. Quote 26. Positivism necessarily understood science itself in an unhistorical way. This passage critiques positivism for failing to recognize the historical and social contexts that shape scientific knowledge. While positivism sees science as an objective and unchanging pursuit of external reality, materialism argues that both the process of acquiring knowledge and the knowledge itself are influenced by human activity. Materialism, therefore, takes a more dynamic view of science, acknowledging its historical development and the social forces that shape it. Quote 27. Positivism makes peace, in principle, with every kind of superstition. The quote highlights a key critique of positivism. By limiting knowledge to appearances and external data, positivism opens the door to superstition. Since positivism denies the possibility of understanding the true nature of things, it leaves room for speculative, unscientific beliefs to flourish. Materialism, in contrast, insists on a deeper engagement with reality, rejecting both metaphysical speculation and the superficiality of positivist approaches. Quote 28. Materialism, too, seeks an historical comprehension of all spiritual phenomena. Materialism approaches spiritual and intellectual phenomena from a historical perspective, understanding them as products of specific social and material conditions. Unlike metaphysical systems that treat such phenomena as timeless or eternal, materialism sees them as contingent, shaped by the historical processes and social relations of the time. This historical approach allows materialism to critique and demystify spiritual beliefs, situating them within broader material realities. Quote 29. Positivism and intuitionism are simply two different phases of one philosophy which downgrades natural knowledge and hypostatizes abstract conceptual structures. This statement draws attention to the similarities between positivism and intuitionism, despite their apparent differences. Both philosophies, according to materialism, abstract reality into conceptual frameworks that disconnect knowledge from its material roots. While positivism focuses on external appearances and intuitionism on subjective experience, both fail to engage with the material conditions underlying knowledge and experience, making them inadequate in addressing real-world concerns. Quote 30. Materialism refuses, however, to distinguish between happiness and pleasure, because the satisfaction of desire, unlike higher motives, requires no reasons, excuses, or justifications. Materialism rejects the distinction between happiness and pleasure commonly found in idealist philosophies. For materialism, the fulfillment of human desires, whether physical or emotional, is a natural fact that does not need to be justified by higher moral or metaphysical principles. This view opposes idealist claims that certain pleasures or happiness require justification or are tied to loftier spiritual goals. Instead, materialism grounds human satisfaction in material needs and conditions. Quote 31. Materialism does not lack ideals, then. Its ideals are shaped with the needs of society as a starting point and are measured by what is possible in the foreseeable future with the human forces available. Contrary to critiques that materialism is devoid of ideals, this quote clarifies that materialist ideals are grounded in the practical needs of society and the possibilities presented by historical conditions. Materialism does not project abstract, eternal ideals, but rather formulates goals that are achievable within the context of present social and material realities. These ideals are dynamic and evolve as society and its productive forces develop. Quote 32. Materialism refuses to relate what has happened and it's happening now, the unique, accidental, momentary event, to an overall context of value and meaning. Materialism rejects the tendency to interpret historical events as part of a larger, preordained plan, or to attribute overarching meaning to them. This stance opposes the idealist approach of imposing a teleological or moral framework on history. Instead, materialism sees history as a series of contingent, unique events driven by material conditions and social struggles, without assuming an ultimate metaphysical purpose behind them. Quote 33. The history of mankind has been divided into periods in very varying ways. This quote introduces the idea that historical periodization, or the division of history into distinct eras, is subjective and influenced by the prevailing knowledge and concerns of the time. The way history is divided reflects the values and understanding of the people making those divisions, not just the objective events themselves. This highlights the role of culture, knowledge, and the present in shaping our interpretation of the past. Quote 34. Materialism, on the contrary, rejects such a metaphysical factor and tries to find an answer by uncovering the economic dynamism which determines the course, development, and decline of each period. Here, the quote contrasts materialism with idealist philosophies that explain history through metaphysical principles like the self-revelation of intellectual beings. Instead, materialism focuses on the economic forces driving historical change. It seeks to explain historical transformations in terms of material conditions, specifically how human relationships to nature and the means of production shape society over time. Quote 35. If the direction and tempo of this process is ultimately determined by regularities within the economic apparatus of a society, yet the way in which men act at a given point in time cannot be explained solely by economic events which have transpired in the immediate past. This quote emphasizes that while materialist theory sees economic structures as foundational in shaping society, it does not reduce human behavior entirely to economic factors. People's actions are influenced by a range of social institutions and cultural practices, such as the family and education, which have evolved over time. Thus, materialism also accounts for the historical development of the psyche and cultural norms. Quote 36. Culture at each moment in time is a sum total of forces at work amid the change of cultures. Culture is seen as a dynamic, ever-changing totality that interacts with social structures and institutions. At any given time, culture is not a static entity, but the product of various forces that shape and are shaped by human behavior and society. This view rejects the idea of culture as a fixed or isolated sphere, showing how it continuously evolves alongside other aspects of social life. Quote 37. The so-called social nature of man, his self-integration into a given order of things, is essentially reducible to the memory of the acts of force by which men were made sociable and civilized. This quote suggests that human social behavior and the integration into societal norms are largely the result of coercion and force, rather than some inherent moral or rational essence. Society imposes order through systems of punishment and reward, and over time, this coercion becomes internalized, forming the basis of what is perceived as natural social behavior. Quote 38. The complicated historical process in which coercion was partially interiorized was, in addition, not a simple transposition to the intellectual level. Instead, new qualities arose everywhere in the process. Coercion, once external, gradually becomes internalized in human consciousness and cultural practices. But this transformation is not straightforward. As coercion becomes part of human psyche and society, it takes on new forms, influencing religion, morality, and social structures in ways that go beyond mere force. The result is a complex social order that reflects both the original coercive structures and the new cultural elements that emerge. Quote 39. Although moral awareness, conscience, and the concept of duty, for example, have developed in intimate connection with coercion, yet in the psychic economy of the individual, they are, in the last analysis, specific powers which lead him not only to accept existing conditions, but also at times to oppose them. While moral and ethical ideas may have their origins in coercion and societal pressures, they develop into independent forces within the psyche that can drive individuals to either conform to or rebel against the social order. This highlights the dual role of morality. It can uphold societal norms, but also inspire opposition to those same norms when they become unjust or oppressive. Quote 40. In China, belief in ancestors is such a cultural factor. Sinologists agree that it has molded the features of Chinese society for centuries. This quote illustrates how specific cultural practices, such as the belief in ancestors in China, play a significant role in shaping societal structures and individual behavior over time. These cultural factors, deeply rooted in history, become stabilizing forces that resist external changes, including economic or political transformations. They demonstrate the powerful influence of long-standing cultural traditions on societal continuity. Quote 41. The elder who, through a lifetime, has observed the weather, the peculiar traits of each type of plant, their diseases, and so on, becomes for the young man a source of indispensable knowledge. This quote explains the societal role of elders in traditional agrarian communities. The experience accumulated by older generations, particularly regarding agricultural practices, made them natural leaders in production. Their knowledge was essential for younger generations, which fostered reverence for ancestors. This respect eventually extended beyond the living, leading to the veneration of deceased ancestors as wise and powerful figures, a belief that became ingrained in the culture and psyche of the community. Quote 42. Belief in ancestors allows troubled men to preserve and renew their inner peace. Ancestor worship provided psychological comfort and a sense of security for individuals facing uncertainty. By seeking advice from ancestors, often through rituals like drawing lots, people believed they could influence their fate. Even when such beliefs became counterproductive in modern contexts, individuals and social groups clung to them for the stability and reassurance they offered. In places like China, reverence for ancestors became an obstacle to societal progress, delaying reforms and modernization efforts. Quote 43. The terrible differentiation in ways of work and life, which enables the Indian life process to succeed, was rendered intelligible by the idea of the transmigration of souls. In India, the caste system was supported by the religious belief in reincarnation. This doctrine justified social inequalities, as people believed their caste was a result of actions in previous lives. This belief gave even the lowest castes a reason to accept their position, hoping for a better rebirth. It made the oppressive caste system seem meaningful and eternal, discouraging efforts to change or challenge the system, as such attempts would undermine the spiritual rationale behind it. Quote 44. The opposition which the caste system, because of its religious backing, offers to the spread of new social forms does not mean that religion is independent of the material life of society. Religion, although often seen as separate from material conditions, is deeply connected to the social and economic realities of the time. The caste system in India is an example where religious beliefs serve to maintain existing social structures. While religion can resist social change, it is not an independent force, but rather a cultural institution shaped by material conditions. The economic foundation of society often drives changes in religion, even if religion initially resists these shifts. Quote 45. The fact that both of these occur, as well as the manner in which they occur, are themselves conditioned by the dispositions of men at any given point in history. This quote highlights that both the exercise of power and the deception of the masses are shaped by the psychological and cultural dispositions of people at a given time. Human nature, far from being a fixed essence, is molded by historical and social contexts. The preservation of outdated social structures depends not only on coercion or deception, but also on the internalized beliefs and behaviors of individuals, which have been shaped by their material and social environments. Quote 46. The relatively stable system of long-practiced, effortless behavior, which men of a particular period and class manifest, is preserved in many instances only because to leave the old way of life and to adopt a new one requires strength and courage. People often cling to old ways of life and social structures because changing them requires significant psychological effort. The familiar routines, beliefs, and behaviors, even when they no longer serve their material interests, provide comfort and security. Adopting a new way of life, especially one that demands more rational thought and active participation, can be daunting. This inertia helps explain why social changes are slow and why old systems persist, even when they are no longer effective or just. Quote 47. One function of the entire cultural apparatus at any given period has been to internalize in men of subordinate position the idea of a necessary domination of some men over others. This quote reflects how culture plays a crucial role in maintaining social hierarchies. Throughout history, cultural institutions such as family, religion, and education have worked to instill the belief in subordinates that domination by others is a natural and necessary part of life. This internalization of authority helps to stabilize and perpetuate unequal social structures, as those in subordinate positions come to accept their roles as inevitable, limiting resistance to the status quo. Quote 48. Authority as accepted dependence can thus imply a relationship which fosters progress, is in the interests of all parties, and favors the development of human powers. Authority is not inherently negative. In certain historical contexts, accepted dependence on authority can promote social progress and the development of human potential. When authority serves the collective good and supports the growth of individuals and society, it can be a productive and necessary part of social organization. However, when authority becomes a tool for maintaining outdated or oppressive systems, it hinders progress and perpetuates human suffering. Quote 49. The characteristic mark of a cultivated public is absolute freedom and independence of thought. Its outlook is formed by the determination to submit to no authority whatsoever, and in all matters to rely on its own reflection, while rejecting without qualification anything which it cannot thus confirm. In this quote, the cultivated public is described as valuing total intellectual freedom, relying on personal reason rather than accepting beliefs based on external authority. This independence of thought marks the difference between the cultivated and uncultivated. The latter may think they hold personal convictions, but these are often shaped by the prevailing societal norms. True cultivation, therefore, lies in the refusal to accept ideas without personal reflection, and the moral duty to reject authority when one can no longer believe in it. Quote 50. Reason captures more and more ground from faith, until it has wholly annihilated it and taken up its content into the nobler form of clear insight. This quote discusses the historical struggle between faith and reason, suggesting that reason progressively encroaches on the territory once held by faith, eventually replacing it with rational understanding. In this view, history is seen as a conflict between these two forces, with reason destined to triumph. The quote reflects the Enlightenment belief in the superiority of rational thought over traditional religious beliefs, emphasizing that progress is marked by the growing dominance of reason. Quote 51. Authority is the ground for a blind and slavish submission, which originates subjectively in psychic inertia and inability to make one's own decisions, and which contributes objectively to the continuation of constraining and unworthy conditions of life. Authority, in this context, is criticized for fostering passive obedience, arising from people's psychological unwillingness or incapacity to think independently. This submission perpetuates social conditions that are oppressive and limiting. The quote highlights how authority can trap individuals in unworthy lives, maintained not just through coercion, but through the internalization of dependence. This form of submission becomes self-sustaining and contributes to the stagnation of human development. Quote 52. The individual was regarded as wholly isolated and complete in himself. It could seem that the dismantling of the old authorities was the only thing required if he was to exercise his full potential. Here, the individual is portrayed as a self-sufficient being, leading to the belief that simply removing external authorities would allow him to achieve full potential. However, this view overlooks the broader social and economic structures that also influence the individual's ability to thrive. It reflects the ideal of bourgeois individualism, where freedom is conceived as the absence of external control, but in reality, individuals remain subjected to other forces, such as economic pressures, that limit their freedom. Quote 53. Men have been freed from the limitations of the old, divinely sanctioned property system. The new one is regarded as natural, as the manifestation of a thing in itself which is beyond discussion and eludes human influence. This quote points out that while traditional systems of authority, like those justified by divine will, have been dismantled, the new economic order is similarly unquestioned. It is treated as a natural, unchangeable fact, even though it too is a product of human construction. This shift highlights how authority continues to manifest in new forms, maintaining control over individuals by presenting itself as beyond human intervention, reinforcing the idea of submission to an external, uncontrollable system. Quote 54. In acknowledging the authority of economic facts, the worker was in practice acknowledging the power and authority of the employer. This quote illustrates how economic necessity compels workers to accept the authority of their employers, even though they may outwardly appear to be free agents. The acceptance of economic conditions as unchangeable leads workers to submit to the authority of those who control the means of production. This submission is cloaked in the guise of free contract and equality, but in reality it reflects the deep inequalities and power imbalances inherent in the economic system. Quote 55. The effort to ground in apparently natural circumstances and to present as inescapable the dependence which men experienced provides the conscious and unconscious motivation for part of the literature on cultural history. This quote emphasizes how certain cultural and historical narratives attempt to justify social dependence by portraying it as natural and unavoidable. By framing social hierarchies as the result of natural laws, these narratives obscure the human-made nature of these structures and the possibility of change. This perspective serves to maintain existing power relations by convincing people that their subordination is inevitable rather than socially constructed. Unfreedom, quote 56. Here means a dependence, not grounded in reason, on the ideas, decisions, and actions of other men. That is, it means precisely what bourgeois thinkers objected to about the Middle Ages. This quote explains how unfreedom is defined as a form of dependence where individuals are subjected to the decisions and ideas of others without rational justification. This type of subordination was what bourgeois thinkers criticized in medieval society, where authority was often inherited or based on tradition rather than reason. In modern contexts, this unfreedom manifests when people adapt to economic conditions as if they were natural facts, without recognizing the underlying social relationships that perpetuate these conditions. Quote 57. The political leadership is effective because great masses of men consciously and unconsciously accept their economic dependence as necessary, or at least do not yet fully realize it. The quote highlights how political authority is sustained by the masses' acceptance of their economic dependence as inevitable. This uncritical acceptance allows authoritarian structures to thrive. Until people become aware of the contingent nature of their economic circumstances and challenge this dependency, political authority remains unshaken. This relationship between economic and political authority reinforces the deeper social structures that keep individuals in a state of submission. Quote 58. The whole political, religious, and philosophical literature of the modern period is filled with praise of authority, obedience, self-sacrifice, and the hard fulfillment of duty. This quote reflects how modern literature across various domains, politics, religion, and philosophy, has traditionally exalted values like obedience, duty, and sacrifice. These virtues were promoted to align individuals with the authority structures of their time, encouraging conformity to social and economic hierarchies. The celebration of such ideals served to reinforce the status quo, often under the guise of higher ideals like reason and freedom, which masked the coercive forces at play. Quote 59. Men therefore continue simply to accept and confirm where they might be shapers, and to do without the freedom they need ever more urgently, namely, to regulate and direct the social work process and thereby human relations generally in a reasonable way. This quote laments the fact that individuals often accept the existing social conditions rather than actively shaping them. The freedom that people truly need, the ability to direct social and economic processes in a rational and cooperative manner, remains unrealized. Instead, people passively conform to the structures in place, failing to recognize their potential to collectively transform society for the common good. Quote 60. The free sale of his powers of work is the condition for the growth in power of the overlords, yet the discrepancy between merit and power in both cases grows beyond all belief. This passage critiques the capitalist system, where workers sell their labor power, which ultimately serves to increase the wealth and influence of the ruling class. Despite workers' effort and merit, the gap between their contributions and the rewards they receive grows wider. The quote highlights the growing disconnect between the value of one's labor and the rewards or power they accrue, underscoring the inherent inequality in the system. Quote 61. Success is not meaningfully related to effort, which may surpass that of others in power, intelligence, and progressiveness. The quote points out that in modern society, success is often disconnected from individual merit or effort. People who work harder or possess greater intelligence and abilities do not necessarily achieve greater success. Instead, success is more likely determined by external factors, such as wealth or social connections. This exposes the myth that effort and talent alone lead to success, revealing the arbitrary and unequal nature of societal reward systems. Quote 62. Even real merit, surpassing knowledge, and practical ability are affected and distorted by it. They are regarded less as a widely distributed blessing than a legal title for power and exploitation. This quote suggests that even genuine talent and knowledge are twisted by societal structures, becoming tools for exploitation rather than contributions to the common good. In a system where authority is based on possession or luck, merit becomes a justification for power and dominance. The social recognition of merit, then, is not about rewarding true ability, but about reinforcing existing hierarchies and power structures, which use merit as a way to legitimize exploitation. Quote 63. To recognize facts means to accept them. Distinctions established by nature are willed by God, and, in bourgeois society, wealth and poverty seem naturally determined. This quote reflects the idea that bourgeois society treats economic and social distinctions, such as wealth and poverty, as natural and unchangeable facts. People are taught to accept these distinctions as part of the natural order, ordained by a higher power, which discourages any challenge to the status quo. This belief system legitimizes social inequalities by framing them as inevitable, rather than as products of human-made systems that could be altered. Quote 64. In the Protestant concept of God, the reification of authority finds direct expression. It is not because God is wise and good that men owe him reverence and obedience. This quote explains how, within Protestantism, authority is viewed not as a relationship built on the wisdom or goodness of the authority figure, but as an inherent quality of the superior being. Obedience to God is demanded not due to rational or moral superiority, but because authority itself is seen as a fixed, reified property. This reflects a broader societal trend where authority is treated as an unquestionable force, much like economic or social structures that individuals submit to without question, seeing them as natural or inevitable. Quote 65. The unmediated identification of natural strength with estimability in the bourgeois family operates as an educational factor with reference to the authority structure characteristic of this society. This quote highlights how, within the bourgeois family, the father's natural strength is equated with moral worth, teaching children to accept authority based on physical or economic power. This familial dynamic mirrors the larger societal structure, where authority is linked to power and wealth rather than moral or intellectual merit. It sets the stage for individuals to accept social hierarchies and authority figures in the broader world, as these structures are learned and reinforced from a young age within the family. Quote 66. The spiritual world into which the child grows in consequence of such dependence, as well as the fantasies with which he peoples the real world, his dreams and wishes, his ideas and judgments, are all dominated by the thought of man's power over man, of above and below, of command and obedience. This quote describes how the child's worldview, shaped by the power dynamics in the family, becomes dominated by hierarchical structures. The child's imagination, thoughts, and judgments are filled with notions of authority, subordination, and control, reflecting the societal norms of command and obedience. This early internalization of hierarchical relationships conditions the child to accept similar structures in society without questioning their validity. Quote 67. To yield to his father because the latter has the money is, in his eyes, the only reasonable thing to do, independently of any consideration of the father's human qualities. This quote emphasizes the way children in bourgeois families come to equate economic power with moral authority. The child learns to obey the father primarily because he controls financial resources, rather than because of any inherent moral or intellectual superiority. This acceptance of authority based on material wealth conditions the child to see economic power as a legitimate basis for control in society, regardless of personal merit. Quote 68. The father's economic and educational service to his children is indispensable. In his educational and governing function, even in his strictness, he is meeting a genuine social need, even if in a problematic fashion. This quote acknowledges that, Despite the problematic aspects of paternal authority, the father's role in educating and providing for his children is socially necessary. The father's authority, though often exercised through coercion or power, fulfills a critical function in preparing children for societal life. However, this necessary role is complicated by the tension between the father's genuine contributions and the problematic way authority is enforced and justified. Quote 69. In members of the upper classes, the results of this education for living under authority show more in an objectivity, an openness to all things. Among the lower classes, the result has been directly to increase the masochistic inclination to surrender one's will to any leader whatsoever. This quote contrasts the effects of authority-oriented education between social classes. For the upper classes, the education produces individuals who are open-minded and tolerant, while among the lower classes, it fosters a submissive mindset and a tendency to uncritically follow any strong leader. This dichotomy reveals how authority functions differently across class lines, shaping individuals to either wield or submit to power based on their social position. Quote 70. The impulse of submission, however, is not a timeless drive, but a phenomenon emerging essentially from the limited bourgeois family. The quote challenges the notion that submission is an innate human tendency, arguing instead that it is a product of the bourgeois family structure. This family system instills the habit of submission in children, teaching them to accept authority as a natural part of life. The impulse to submit is thus culturally constructed rather than biologically determined, arising from the social and familial conditions that shape an individual's character. Quote 71. The bad conscience that is developed in the family absorbs more energies than can be counted, which might otherwise be directed against the social circumstances that play a role in the individual's failure. This quote illustrates how the family instills feelings of guilt and self-blame in individuals, diverting their attention away from the broader social causes of their struggles. Instead of questioning the societal structures that contribute to their failures, individuals internalize guilt, believing their shortcomings are personal. This internalized guilt prevents people from directing their energy toward critiquing or challenging the social systems that oppress them. Quote 72. If justice is in fact embodied in the society and state of the day, even though these do not respect the individual's uniqueness but are absolutely indifferent to it, then the reduction of the individual to nothing but the representative of an economic function is philosophically canonized and made permanent. This quote critiques the way society and the state reduce individuals to mere economic functions, ignoring their unique qualities. It suggests that when justice is framed in this way, it becomes institutionalized and made permanent, stripping people of their individuality. The individual's worth is tied only to their role in the economy, which is justified as part of a broader philosophical system, leaving little room for personal identity or value beyond economic contribution. Quote 73. The patriarchal system introduced mankind to class conflict and to the rupture between public and familial life, while within the family, the principle of naked authority came to be applied. This quote reflects how the shift to a patriarchal system not only introduced class conflict, but also caused a separation between public life and family life. Within the family, authority became absolute and unchallenged, a reflection of the hierarchical structures emerging in society. This division set the stage for deeper societal struggles, as power dynamics within the family mirrored the oppressive systems outside of it, fostering further conflicts rooted in class and authority. Quote 74. The familial role of the woman strengthens the authority of the status quo in two ways. Her concern is with her own and her children's economic security. This quote emphasizes how women's roles in the family reinforce the prevailing social order. Their dependence on their husband's economic position links their interests directly to the stability of the current system. The responsibility for securing the family's financial well-being makes them supportive of their husband's ambition and unwilling to rebel against societal structures, as doing so could threaten their security. This complicity helps maintain existing power relations. Quote 75. The struggle against certain historical conditions ceases to be a matter simply of personal courage and becomes the sacrifice of persons dear to him. The quote explains how the resistance to societal structures is not only a personal challenge, but also becomes a dilemma involving one's family. For a man, fighting against unjust historical conditions often means risking the well-being of his loved ones, making rebellion much more difficult. The fear of causing harm to the family leads many to accept the status quo, thereby reinforcing the existing social and political systems through emotional and moral constraints. Quote 76. Under the pressure of such a family situation, the individual does not learn to understand and respect his mother in her concrete existence, that is, as this particular social and sexual being. This quote highlights how the familial structure distorts relationships, especially between children and their mothers. Children are taught to see their mother not as a fully realized person with her own social and sexual identity, but through an idealized and sanitized lens. This repression of the mother's reality reinforces broader societal divisions between the personal and the public, as well as between idealized femininity and the realities of human existence, limiting the child's capacity for genuine understanding. Quote 77. Because the woman bows to the law of the patriarchal family, she becomes an instrument for maintaining authority in this society. This quote captures how women's submission to patriarchal family structures makes them agents in the perpetuation of societal authority. By accepting the rules of male-dominated families, women unwittingly reinforce the same hierarchical systems that subjugate them. Their compliance strengthens the authority of the status quo, as they transmit these values to their children and reinforce them within the household. Quote 78. In the bourgeois golden age, there was a fruitful interaction between family and society, because the authority of the father was based on his role in society, while society was renewed by the education for authority which went on in the patriarchal family. This quote reflects on the historical alignment between family and society during the bourgeois era, where the father's authority in the family mirrored his societal role. The family became a site of social education, preparing children to accept authority, which in turn reinforced societal structures. This reciprocal relationship between family authority and social hierarchy helped maintain the social order, as the family both reflected and reproduced the values of the larger society. Quote 79. The concept of God was for a long time the place where the idea was kept alive that there are other norms besides those to which nature and society give expression in their operation. This quote suggests that the idea of God historically served as a way to preserve ideals and values that transcended the realities of nature and society. It reflects how religion maintained the belief in higher, alternative norms and values, offering hope and a counterpoint to the often harsh and unjust conditions of earthly life. Religion, in this sense, acted as a safeguard for moral and ethical standards that went beyond the material world. Quote 80. Religion is the record of the wishes, desires, and accusations of countless generations. Religion is portrayed here as a repository of human longing, capturing the collective hopes, grievances, and dissatisfactions of people throughout history. It records not only spiritual aspirations, but also social and personal desires for justice, fulfillment, and meaning. In this way, religion reflects the deep emotional and existential needs of humanity, serving as both a testament to human suffering and a vehicle for expressing resistance to the imperfections of life. Quote 81. It is impossible that such justice should ever become a reality within history. For even if a better society develops and eliminates the present disorder, there will be no compensation for the wretchedness of past ages and no end to the distress in nature. This quote emphasizes the inherent limitations of human justice. Even if society progresses and overcomes present injustices, it can never fully compensate for the suffering of the past or eliminate all sources of distress, particularly those caused by nature. The notion of perfect justice remains an unattainable ideal within history, reflecting the tragic dimension of human existence, where suffering and imperfection are inevitable despite our best efforts. Quote 82. The productive kind of criticism of the status quo which found expression in earlier times as a belief in a heavenly judge today takes the form of a struggle for more rational forms of societal life. Here, the quote indicates that where religious belief once served as the foundation for criticizing societal injustice, by invoking the idea of a heavenly judge, modern criticism has shifted toward the pursuit of rational societal reforms. The struggle for justice and better social conditions now manifests in practical, human-centered efforts to create a more equitable society, moving away from religious frameworks toward secular, reason-based approaches. Quote 83. A purely spiritual resistance becomes just a wheel in the machine of the totalitarian state. This quote critiques the ineffectiveness of purely spiritual resistance in confronting totalitarian regimes. In such a system, passive or purely internal spiritual opposition does not challenge the power structures, but instead becomes complicit, functioning as part of the broader apparatus of control. It suggests that genuine resistance must go beyond spiritual contemplation and involve direct, tangible action to oppose the authoritarian state. Quote 84. Mankind loses religion as it moves through history, but the loss leaves its mark behind. This quote reflects on the historical decline of religion and its influence, acknowledging that while humanity may move away from religious belief, the legacy of religion remains. The values, desires, and aspirations once contained within religious frameworks continue to influence human thought and social practice, even as religion itself wanes. The departure from religion does not erase its impact, but transforms its role in shaping human culture and action. Quote 85. In a really free mind, the concept of infinity is preserved in an awareness of the finality of human life and of the inalterable aloneness of men. This quote explores how, in a truly liberated consciousness, the idea of infinity persists not as a religious concept, but as a recognition of life's limitations. The awareness of mortality and human isolation becomes a source of clarity, preventing false optimism or grandiose beliefs about human progress. The acknowledgement of life's finality and the solitude of existence fosters a more grounded and thoughtful approach to life, without the need for religious illusions. Quote 86. Metaphysics claims to apprehend being, to grasp totality, and to lay bare by means of cognitive methods available to every man a meaning of the world, independent of man. This quote describes metaphysics as an intellectual pursuit that seeks to understand the ultimate nature of reality, presenting itself as a system of knowledge that transcends human subjectivity. It attempts to reveal the underlying essence of existence and offers a worldview that is detached from individual experience. However, the passage also hints at the limitations of metaphysics, especially in its conflict with more empirical and scientific modes of thought, as it relies on cognitive frameworks that are increasingly seen as outdated in modern philosophical discourse. Quote 87. Science, as it stands today, is the body of knowledge which a given society has assembled in its struggle with nature. This quote suggests that science is not an abstract or neutral collection of facts, but rather a tool that societies develop in their ongoing effort to understand and control the natural world. Science reflects the material and intellectual conditions of the society that produces it, revealing the way that knowledge is shaped by the historical and social struggles of human communities. Science evolves through this interaction, offering insights that are relevant to the immediate concerns and needs of a given society. Quote 88. The religious conception of a pre-established harmony among all things, including man, was abandoned by science as early as the 17th century. This quote points to the historical break between religious and scientific worldviews, emphasizing how early modern science rejected the idea that the universe is governed by a divine, harmonious order. In contrast to the religious belief in a unified, purpose-driven cosmos, science began to focus on the observable and empirical realities of the physical world, leading to a more fragmented and materialistic understanding of existence. This shift marked a fundamental change in how people viewed the relationship between humanity and the universe. Quote 89. With science alone, mirroring as it does the chaotic reality in nature and society, the dissatisfied masses and thinking individuals would be left in a dangerous and desperate state. This quote highlights the limitations of science when it comes to addressing the deeper existential and social needs of individuals. While science provides a rational and empirical understanding of the world, it does not offer the moral or spiritual guidance that many people seek. Without the comforting illusions of metaphysics or religion, people might feel adrift, confronted by the chaotic and often harsh realities of life, leading to a sense of despair. This suggests that science, while powerful, is not sufficient to meet all human needs. Quote 90. The disparagement of empirical evidence in favor of a metaphysical world of illusion has its origin in the conflict between the emancipated individual of bourgeois society and his fate within that society. This quote explains how metaphysical beliefs emerge as a response to the alienation experienced by individuals in bourgeois society. Metaphysics offers a way to escape from the harsh realities of social existence by creating a comforting illusion that transcends the empirical world. This tension between individual freedom and societal constraints leads people to seek solace in metaphysical ideals, which provide a sense of meaning and significance that their everyday lives may lack. Quote 91. Positivism is hostile to everything that savors of illusion. Here, only experience, purified experience in the strict sense it has received in natural science, is called knowledge. This quote describes the core of positivism, which rejects any form of knowledge that is not based on empirical observation. Positivism values only the kind of knowledge that can be tested and verified through scientific methods, dismissing metaphysical or spiritual ideas as illusions. It emphasizes experience as the foundation of knowledge, insisting that what cannot be observed or measured does not belong to the realm of true understanding. Quote 92. Science is no more than a system for the arrangement and rearrangement of facts, and it matters not what facts are selected from the infinite number that present themselves. This quote critiques the view of science as a mere process of organizing facts, without concern for the broader meaning or significance of those facts. It suggests that science, when detached from human values and historical context, becomes an exercise in cataloging data rather than a meaningful endeavor. By focusing solely on the technical arrangement of knowledge, science risks losing sight of the deeper questions about human existence and the world. Quote 93. The empirical and rationalist modes of thought are more closely related in this respect than their adherents would presume. This quote suggests that while empiricism and rationalism are often seen as opposing philosophical schools, they share underlying similarities. Both frameworks posit that there are fixed forms of knowledge and reality, which leads them to adopt rigid views about the structure of the world. Despite their differences in method, both assume that the world can be understood through a set of constant principles, which limits their ability to accommodate change or development in knowledge. Quote 94. The naive harmonistic belief which underlies his ideal conception of the unity of science belongs to the passing world of liberalism. This quote critiques the belief that science can be a unified, harmonious system of knowledge, a view that stems from the liberal optimism of earlier eras. This belief fails to recognize the complexities and contradictions within scientific and social processes. It reflects a bygone era of liberal thought that assumed all aspects of knowledge could eventually be reconciled into a single, coherent framework, ignoring the tensions and conflicts inherent in human understanding. Quote 95. The idea of radically eliminating the subject not only from physics, but also from the process of cognition generally by declaring individual differences themselves to be mere series of facts is itself a principle of research that stands in need of careful restriction. This quote critiques the tendency in some scientific approaches to remove the subjective element from the process of knowledge, reducing individual experiences and differences to mere data points. While this objective stance has its place in research, it can lead to an overly mechanical view of human cognition and reality. This perspective risks overlooking the complex, subjective factors that influence knowledge production and human experience. Quote 96. Logical empiricism holds the view, notwithstanding some of its assertions, that the forms of knowledge, and consequently the relations of man to nature and to other men, never change. This quote highlights how logical empiricism assumes that the basic structures of knowledge and the ways humans relate to nature and each other are fixed. It ignores the possibility that these relationships evolve over time due to historical and social changes. This static view of knowledge limits the scope of understanding, as it fails to account for the dynamic nature of human existence and the development of knowledge across different eras. Quote 97. The occurrence of the probable sometimes depends on human factors, however, but behaviorism passes over this fact in laying down its categories, declaring that it belongs to another branch of science. This quote points out the limitations of behaviorism, which tends to ignore the role of human agency in determining outcomes, treating all behavior as part of predictable patterns. While behaviorism excels in explaining regularities in human actions, it often neglects the subjective factors, such as individual decisions or motivations, that can influence these outcomes. This reductionist approach leaves human complexity unexplored, relegating important aspects of behavior to other fields. Quote 98. In society, a man is paterfamilias under one aspect, businessman under another, thinker under a third. To be more precise, he is not a human being at all, but all these aspects, and many more, in an inevitable succession. This quote describes how modern society fragments individuals into multiple roles, stripping them of a coherent sense of self. Instead of being seen as whole human beings, people are reduced to a series of functional roles, parent, worker, thinker, that they switch between depending on the context. This compartmentalization of life reflects the alienation produced by modern social and economic structures, where individuals are defined more by their social functions than by their humanity. Quote 99. Empiricism falsely considers this universality to be particular and determinate, and the only thing that can be believed. This quote critiques empiricism for treating its particular observations as universal truths, failing to recognize the limits of its own methods. By focusing only on what can be empirically observed and measured, empiricism assumes that this is the only valid form of knowledge, ignoring other ways of understanding the world. This narrow focus leads to a distorted view of reality, where the complexities and subtleties of human experience are overlooked in favor of observable facts. Quote 100. Because they are harnessed to an economic machine which destroys every inner freedom, because their intellectual development is retarded by cunning methods of education and propaganda, their country would then resemble both an insane asylum and a prison. This quote reflects on how individuals, subjected to oppressive economic and political systems, lose their capacity for inner freedom and critical thinking. Their development is stunted by systematic manipulation through education and propaganda, which makes them unaware of their real interests. As a result, society becomes like a prison or asylum, where people are trapped in mental and social confinement, unable to break free from the ideologies that bind them. The oppressive system distorts their perceptions, making them incapable of seeing through the lies they are forced to live with. Quote 101. Empiricism could easily come to such a fate, without having the slightest conception of how to avoid it. Here, the quote points out the vulnerability of empiricism, as a philosophy, to become trapped in a system of thought that cannot address the deeper, underlying causes of social and political oppression. Empiricism focuses solely on observable facts and lacks the tools to question the broader structures of power and ideology. By neglecting the critical engagement with reality, empiricism can end up supporting a status quo that leads to human degradation without even recognizing its complicity. Quote 102. Dialectical thought integrates the empirical constituents into structures of experience, which are important not only for the limited purposes served by science, but also for the historical interests with which dialectic thought is connected. This quote emphasizes the strength of dialectical thinking, which not only uses empirical facts, but also situates them within larger historical and social contexts. Unlike the narrow focus of empirical science, dialectical thought seeks to understand how individual facts relate to broader social processes and historical change. It creates a more holistic view of reality, one that addresses not just scientific concerns, but also the struggles for a more just and human society. Quote 103. The empiricist would not even admit those tendencies and counter-tendencies as Ballungen, through which he usually connects the concepts of vulgar language with his formulas. This quote criticizes empiricism for dismissing the dynamic forces, tendencies and counter-tendencies that shape social reality. By focusing only on fixed, isolated facts, empiricism fails to account for the dialectical nature of historical development, where opposing forces constantly interact. The empiricist approach thus reduces complex social realities to simplistic formulas, missing the deeper movements and contradictions that drive historical progress and social change. Quote 104. The task of the scientist is to find facts, not to indulge in prophetic insights. This quote reflects the limitation of the empirical scientist, whose role is restricted to gathering observable data without engaging in broader speculation about the future or social implications. The scientist, bound by this narrow definition of knowledge, avoids making any predictions or judgments about how society should evolve. This detachment can lead to a failure to address urgent social or political problems, as science remains neutral and disengaged from the real struggles shaping the world. Quote 105. The autonomously acting individual discerns unity and interdependence, where the servile consciousness perceives only disparity, and conversely. This quote draws a distinction between those who act independently and critically, and those whose minds are shaped by servile conformity. The autonomous individual is capable of seeing connections and relationships that the servile consciousness, bound by the status quo, cannot perceive. This insight is crucial for understanding how individuals in oppressive systems either submit to or challenge the prevailing social order, with autonomy leading to a clearer understanding of societal structures and interdependencies. Quote 106. Right thinking depends as much on right willing as right willing on right thinking. This quote highlights the interdependence between thought and action, suggesting that moral and intellectual clarity arise from both a will to pursue justice and the ability to think critically. One cannot separate the two. Just as ethical action requires sound thinking is guided by the will to achieve a better, more humane society. This reciprocal relationship underscores the importance of aligning one's thoughts and actions in the pursuit of truth and justice. Quote 107. As has been shown, this philosophical position, by virtue of its very nature, cannot possess a single legitimate weapon to combat any form of mass delusion once the latter has attracted sufficient followers. This quote critiques the limitations of empiricism in confronting mass delusions or false beliefs that gain widespread acceptance. Without the tools of critical reasoning or deeper philosophical reflection, empiricism is ill-equipped to challenge widely held but irrational beliefs. Empiricism's reliance on observable facts prevents it from addressing the underlying ideologies that fuel these delusions, leaving it powerless in the face of collective irrationality. Quote 108. The superficiality and presumption with which the new empiricists pass judgment on the products of intellectual activity parallel an attitude to culture which now and then finds practical expression in nationalistic uprisings and the bonfires associated with them. This quote compares the dismissive attitude of modern empiricists toward metaphysical thought with the destructive tendencies of nationalist movements that seek to eliminate complex intellectual and cultural traditions. Both phenomena reflect a superficial understanding of knowledge, where depth and nuance are sacrificed in favor of simplicity and immediacy. This critique highlights the danger of reducing all thought to empirical data, which can lead to cultural regression and intellectual shallowness. Quote 109. The naive misapprehension of the mathematical logicians is especially evident in their conception that every judgment in any line of thought must be of the same nature as the one which expresses the relatively simple fact that it is cold. This quote points out the limitations of logical empiricism, which assumes that all judgments are as straightforward as simple factual statements, like those describing the temperature. In reality, complex philosophical or social judgments require deeper context and understanding, which cannot be reduced to such simplistic, isolated facts. The critique here is that empiricism fails to grasp the richness and complexity of human knowledge by treating all judgments as equally reducible to basic facts. Quote 110. Harmony and significant existence, which metaphysics wrongly designates as true reality, as against the contradictions of the phenomenal world, are not meaningless. This quote acknowledges that while metaphysics may be incorrect in treating harmony and meaning as the ultimate reality, these concepts are not without value. They represent deep human aspirations for coherence and understanding in a world full of contradictions. The failure of empiricism to engage with such metaphysical ideas leaves it unable to address the broader human need for meaning, reducing life to mere facts without significance. Quote 111. The confounding of calculatory with rational thinking as such solidifies the monadological isolation of the individual engendered by the present form of economy. This quote critiques the confusion between calculative thinking, focused on measurement and prediction, and genuine rationality, which involves understanding and reflection. This confusion reinforces the isolation of individuals in modern capitalist societies, where people are reduced to isolated, calculating entities rather than engaged, reflective beings. By prioritizing calculation over deeper thought, society perpetuates alienation and detachment from meaningful human relationships and communal life. Quote 112. Where, however, man confronts circumstances which do depend on him and yet eyes them as alien and unalterable, his thought is bound to be feeble and abstract. This quote highlights the disconnect between individuals and the social conditions they face. When people view situations that they could potentially change as fixed and beyond their control, their ability to think critically and act meaningfully is weakened. This passivity leads to a shallow, ineffective form of thought that fails to engage with the real potential for transformation in the world. Quote 113. A philosophy that confuses logic with logistic and reason with physics must of necessity misjudge the poet. This quote emphasizes the limitations of a philosophy that reduces all knowledge to logical or scientific reasoning. Such an approach fails to appreciate the insights that come from more creative, poetic forms of expression, which can reveal deeper truths about human existence. By conflating logic with the technical processes of science, this philosophy overlooks the value of artistic and emotional understanding, which is essential for grasping the full complexity of life. Quote 114. Theory, for most researchers, is the sum total of propositions about a subject, the propositions being so linked with each other that a few are basic, and the rest derive from these. This quote describes the traditional understanding of theory as a system of interconnected propositions, where a small number of foundational principles serve as the basis from which other ideas are derived. In this view, a theory is evaluated by its coherence and its ability to account for observable facts. The strength of a theory lies in its capacity to generalize from a few key principles, allowing researchers to explain a wide range of phenomena with logical consistency. Quote 115. In relation to facts, therefore, a theory always remains a hypothesis. One must be ready to change it if its weaknesses begin to show as one works through the material. This quote emphasizes that theories are always provisional and subject to change. They are hypotheses that must be tested against empirical data, and if discrepancies arise, the theory must be revised. Theories are not static, but evolve through continuous interaction with the facts they are meant to explain. This dynamic nature of theory reflects the scientific method's requirement for flexibility and adaptation to new evidence. Quote 116. The derivation, as usually practiced in mathematics, is to be applied to all science. The order in the world is captured by a deductive chain of thought. This quote refers to the traditional scientific method, which attempts to explain the world through a process of logical deduction, similar to mathematics. The goal is to create a coherent system of knowledge by deriving complex truths from simpler, foundational principles. This deductive reasoning is seen as a way to impose order on the apparent chaos of the world, revealing the underlying structure of reality. Quote 117. Empirically oriented sociologists have the same idea of what a fully elaborated theory should be as their theoretically oriented brethren. This quote highlights that even in fields like sociology, where empirical observation and data collection are prioritized, there is still a shared understanding of what constitutes a proper theory. Both empirical and theoretical approaches ultimately aim to construct systematic frameworks for understanding social phenomena. The difference lies in the method, but the goal of developing a comprehensive theory remains consistent across both approaches. Quote 118. The traditional idea of theory is based on scientific activity as carried on within the division of labor at a particular stage in the latter's development. This quote suggests that the traditional concept of theory is rooted in the historical and social context of the division of labor. As scientific activity evolved alongside industrial production, the way theories were constructed and applied mirrored the specialized, compartmentalized nature of labor in society. The traditional view of theory, therefore, reflects the specific needs and structures of a particular stage in societal development. Quote 119. The perceived fact is therefore co-determined by human ideas and concepts, even before its conscious theoretical elaboration by the knowing individual. This quote asserts that facts are not purely objective, but are shaped by human ideas and concepts. Before a fact is even consciously recognized or analyzed, it is influenced by the social and intellectual frameworks within which individuals operate. This reflects a critical theory perspective, which argues that facts are always mediated by historical and cultural factors, challenging the notion of purely neutral or objective observation. Quote 120. The opposition of passivity and activity, which appears in knowledge theory as a dualism of sense perception and understanding, does not hold for society, however, in the same measure as for the individual. This quote points out that while individuals may experience a dualism between passive perception and active understanding, this distinction does not apply to society in the same way. Society is an active force, constantly shaping and reshaping the conditions under which individuals perceive and understand the world. This active role of society in the process of knowledge creation complicates the simplistic division between passive observation and active thought. Quote 121. The individual, however, receives sensible reality as a simple sequence of facts into his world of ordered concepts. This quote illustrates how individuals perceive reality as a sequence of isolated facts that they then organize into a conceptual framework. This process happens almost automatically, shaped by societal norms and collective ways of thinking. The harmony between perception and traditional thought is not a coincidence, but a reflection of the social structures that shape both the world and the way individuals understand it. Quote 122. The life of society as a whole proceeds from this economy only at the cost of excessive friction, in a stunted form, and almost, as it were, accidentally. This quote critiques the disorganized and inefficient nature of capitalist society, where the economy drives social life in a way that leads to waste, friction, and suffering. Society does not operate smoothly or rationally, but in a haphazard manner, producing negative outcomes like inequality, exploitation, and war. These outcomes appear as inevitable forces, even though they result from human actions within a flawed economic system. Quote 123. The critical attitude of which we are speaking is wholly distrustful of the rules of conduct with which society as presently constituted provides each of its members. This quote emphasizes that critical theory rejects the norms and rules that current society imposes on individuals. Rather than accepting these norms as natural or unchangeable, critical theory questions them, recognizing that they are products of a specific social order. It seeks to uncover how these rules perpetuate inequality and oppression, and envisions a society where such constraints can be consciously reshaped for the betterment of all. Quote 124. The identification, then, of men of critical mind with their society is marked by tension, and the tension characterizes all the concepts of the critical way of thinking. This quote highlights the tension that critical thinkers feel in their relationship with society. On the one hand, they recognize that society is their own creation, shaped by human actions and decisions. On the other hand, they are deeply aware of the alienation and oppression that this same society produces. This tension informs their thinking and motivates their desire to transform the social order into one that is more just and rational. Quote 125. Critical thought has a concept of man as in conflict with himself until this opposition is removed. This quote underscores that critical theory views human beings as fundamentally divided and in conflict with themselves under current social conditions. Individuals are torn between their potential for rational, free activity and the constraints imposed on them by an irrational and oppressive society. This internal conflict can only be resolved by transforming the social structures that limit human freedom and self-realization. Quote 126. The unity of the social forces which promise liberation is at the same time a source of conflict, because liberation requires the conscious action of the masses, and this requires education and discipline. This quote reflects the paradox within the struggle for liberation. While unity among oppressed groups is necessary for social change, this unity also generates conflict. Liberation is not spontaneous. It requires organized, conscious action, which demands education and discipline. The tension between the desire for freedom and the need for structure and guidance is a central challenge in the process of achieving societal transformation. Quote 127. The theory which projects such a solution to the distress does not labor in the service of an existing reality, but only gives voice to the mystery of that reality. This quote highlights how critical theory seeks to understand and expose the deeper truths of the present social order. It does not work to maintain or improve the current system, but instead aims to reveal the contradictions and hidden aspects that perpetuate suffering and inequality. By doing so, critical theory positions itself as a tool for radical change, challenging the status quo rather than simply explaining it. Quote 128. Critical theory has no material accomplishments to show for itself. The change which it seeks to bring about is not effected gradually, so that success, even if slow, might be steady. This quote reflects the unique challenge of critical theory. It does not have immediate or tangible results like other scientific or technological theories. Its goal is the transformation of society, a process that cannot be measured by gradual successes. Instead, critical theory intensifies the struggle for a better future, with its ultimate success dependent on large-scale societal change rather than incremental progress. Quote 129. The object with which the scientific specialist deals is not affected at all by his own theory. Subject and object are kept strictly apart. This quote describes a fundamental difference between traditional scientific theories and critical theory. In traditional science, the object of study remains unaffected by the theory itself. The scientist observes and analyzes without altering the reality they study. In contrast, critical theory argues that the relationship between subject, the theorist, and object, society, is intertwined, as the theory itself is part of the process of societal change. Quote 130. The judgment passed on the necessity inherent in the previous course of events implies here a struggle to change it from a blind to a meaningful necessity. This quote explains how critical theory views history not as a predetermined path, but as something shaped by human actions. It suggests that understanding the forces that have driven history allows people to transform those forces from something that blindly governs their lives into something that they can consciously shape. Critical theory, therefore, is a tool for moving from passive acceptance of historical forces to active, meaningful engagement with them. Quote 131. The concepts which emerge under its influence are critical of the present. The Marxist categories of class, exploitation, surplus value, profit, pauperization, and breakdown are elements in a conceptual whole, and the meaning of this whole is to be sought not in the preservation of contemporary society, but in its transformation into the right kind of society. This quote emphasizes that the core concepts of Marxist thought, such as class and exploitation, are not just tools for analyzing the current system, but are intended to critique and transform it. These concepts form a unified theory aimed at dismantling the existing social order and replacing it with a more just and equitable system. Critical theory uses these categories to reveal the flaws in contemporary society and to advocate for its radical transformation. Quote 132. The necessity which rules society can be regarded as biological in the sense described, and the unique character of critical theory can therefore be called in question on the grounds that, in biology, as in other natural sciences, particular sequences of events can be theoretically constructed just as they are in the critical theory of society. This quote draws a parallel between the perceived inevitability of certain biological processes and the way social processes are often understood. It challenges the notion that social events are as fixed as biological ones, arguing that critical theory offers a way to question and change these processes, rather than simply accepting them as natural or inevitable. Critical theory seeks to reveal that the mechanisms of society are not beyond human control, but can be altered through conscious effort. Quote 133. Even the critical theory, which stands in opposition to other theories, derives its statements about real relationships from basic universal concepts, as we have indicated, and therefore presents the relationships as necessary. This quote acknowledges that, like traditional theories, critical theory also relies on universal concepts to explain social relationships. However, critical theory distinguishes itself by focusing on the transformative potential of these relationships. It presents them not as static or inevitable, but as dynamic and capable of change through human action. The goal of critical theory is not just to understand the world, but to change it. Quote 134. The hostility to theory as such which prevails in contemporary public life is really directed against the transformative activity associated with critical thinking. This quote emphasizes that the resistance to theory in modern society is not merely about abstract ideas, but specifically about the fear of change that critical theory brings. People resist the challenge that critical theory poses to the status quo, as it threatens to reveal the unnecessary and harmful adaptations they have made to survive within the existing social order. This resistance serves to protect the status quo from intellectual scrutiny and transformation. Quote 135. Today, on the contrary, in the transition from the present form of society to a future one, mankind will for the first time be a conscious subject and actively determine its own way of life. This quote highlights a key difference between past and present transitions in society. Whereas previous societal changes were shaped by historical forces beyond human control, today, for the first time, humanity has the potential to consciously shape its future. This transformation involves a deliberate and organized effort to redesign social and economic relationships, rather than allowing them to evolve passively. Quote 136. The idea of a theory which becomes a genuine force, consisting in the self-awareness of the subjects of a great historical revolution, is beyond the grasp of a mentality typified by such a dualism. This quote critiques the limitations of traditional thinking, which separates thought from action. It suggests that the idea of a theory that actively shapes reality as critical theory does, is foreign to those who maintain a rigid divide between intellectual reflection and practical engagement. For them, theory remains an abstract exercise disconnected from the real struggles and forces that drive historical change. Quote 137. Critical theory does not have one doctrinal substance today, another tomorrow. The changes in it do not mean a shift to a wholly new outlook, as long as the age itself does not radically change. This quote clarifies that while critical theory evolves and adapts to new social conditions, it retains its core principles. Its changes are driven by historical developments, but its foundational goals, such as the transformation of society into a more just and rational order, remain constant. The theory's adaptability reflects the evolving nature of the social conditions it seeks to critique and change. Quote 138. But the first consequence of the theory, which urges a transformation of society as a whole, is only an intensification of the struggle with which the theory is connected. This quote points out that the immediate result of critical theory is not the gradual improvement of society, but a deepening of the struggle against the existing social order. Rather than providing quick, measurable successes, critical theory pushes society toward confrontation with its contradictions, thereby intensifying the conflicts that it seeks to resolve in the long term. Quote 139. The contradiction which arises when parts of the theory are taken as independent entities are thus not due to errors or to a neglect of clear definitions. They are due to the fact that the theory has a historically changing object, which, however, remains identical amid all the changes. This quote explains that contradictions within critical theory are not flaws or mistakes, but reflections of the changing social reality it analyzes. The theory's object, capitalist society, continues to evolve, but its core structure remains the same, and this tension is reflected in the theory itself. Critical theory's strength lies in its ability to adapt to changing circumstances without losing sight of its fundamental critique. Quote 140. The critical theory has no specific influence on its side, except concern for the abolition of social injustice. This quote reveals that critical theory does not rely on political power or institutional backing for its validity. Instead, its primary motivation is the elimination of social injustice. This focus on justice, rather than on material success or societal approval, distinguishes critical theory from other intellectual movements that may be co-opted by existing power structures. Its commitment to justice remains its guiding principle. Quote 141. The critical theory of society, on the other hand, has for its object men as producers of their own historical way of life in its totality. This quote explains that critical theory focuses on human beings as the creators of their own social and historical realities. Unlike traditional scientific theories, which treat facts as independent of human influence, critical theory sees all social and historical conditions as the result of human actions and interactions. It emphasizes that humans are not passive observers, but active participants in shaping the world. Quote 142. Its goal is man's emancipation from slavery. This quote emphasizes that the ultimate aim of critical theory is to liberate humanity from all forms of oppression and domination. Rather than merely increasing knowledge for its own sake, critical theory seeks to transform society in ways that free individuals from economic, social, and political constraints. This goal connects critical theory to the broader philosophical tradition of seeking justice and human freedom. Quote 143. The theory never aims simply at an increase of knowledge as such. This quote highlights that critical theory is not about accumulating knowledge for its own sake, unlike traditional scientific approaches. Instead, it seeks knowledge that contributes to the emancipation of human beings from oppressive conditions. The theory is practical and transformative, designed to change the world, not just to understand it. Quote 144. The economy is the first cause of wretchedness, and critique, theoretical and practical, must address itself primarily to it. This quote identifies the economy as the fundamental source of human misery in modern society. Critical theory argues that the organization of the economy, particularly under capitalism, is the root of exploitation, inequality, and suffering. Therefore, both theoretical critique and practical efforts for social change must focus on transforming economic structures as the first step toward addressing broader social injustices. Quote 145. Economism, to which the critical theory is often reduced, does not consist in giving too much importance to the economy, but in giving it too narrow a scope. This quote clarifies a common misunderstanding of critical theory, which is often accused of focusing too heavily on economic issues. The problem with economism is not its focus on economics, but that it overlooks the broader social, cultural, and political dimensions that also shape human life. Critical theory, while concerned with the economy, insists on a more holistic view of society, recognizing that economic issues are intertwined with other social factors. Quote 146. The critical theory has the dialectical function of measuring every historical stage in the light not only of isolated data and concepts, but of its primary and total content. This quote explains that critical theory evaluates historical developments not by looking at individual events or concepts in isolation, but by examining them in the context of the overall structure of society. It seeks to understand how various social, political, and economic factors interact to shape historical processes, focusing on the totality of social life, rather than isolated phenomena. Quote 147. The truth about the future does not take the form of a verification of data, which differ from others only in having some special importance. Rather, man's own will plays a part in that truth. This quote emphasizes that the future is not predetermined, or simply a matter of analyzing data. Human will and action play a critical role in shaping the future. Critical theory holds that the direction of social development depends on conscious human intervention, and the realization of a better future requires active participation and commitment to social change. Quote 148. Philosophy insists that the actions and aims of man must not be the product of blind necessity. This quote emphasizes that philosophy, unlike other sciences, challenges the notion that human actions and goals are predetermined or fixed by external forces. It argues that human life should not be governed by mere habit or custom, but by conscious thought and reflection. Philosophy seeks to illuminate the forces that shape human behavior, encouraging individuals to take control of their actions and shape their destinies with reason. Quote 149. Philosophy has set itself against mere tradition and resignation in the decisive problems of existence. This quote highlights how philosophy has historically opposed blind adherence to tradition and passive acceptance of the way things are. It takes on the difficult task of questioning long-held beliefs and social norms, bringing awareness to the deep-rooted structures that people often accept as natural or unchangeable. By doing so, philosophy helps individuals recognize the possibility for change and improvement in the fundamental aspects of their lives. Quote 150. Neither the achievements of science by themselves, nor the advance in industrial method, are immediately identical with the real progress of mankind. This quote underscores the critical perspective that technological and scientific progress does not automatically equate to human progress. Although science and technology can offer material advancements, they do not necessarily lead to improvements in human well-being or societal justice. True progress requires a broader understanding of social conditions and human needs, beyond just scientific achievements. Quote 151. Science and technology are only elements in an existing social totality, and it is quite possible that, despite all their achievements, other factors, even the totality itself, could be moving backwards. This quote elaborates on the idea that while science and technology may advance, the overall social system could still regress. The achievements of science do not prevent other aspects of society, such as politics, culture, or morality, from deteriorating. In fact, technological progress can coexist with worsening social conditions, highlighting the need for a more holistic approach to evaluating progress. Quote 152. Philosophy must not simply accept the tasks set for it by the ever-renewed needs of government and industry. This quote critiques the idea that philosophy should limit itself to serving the needs of the existing social order, such as government and industry. Instead, philosophy must transcend these narrow confines and question the larger structures and purposes of society. It should explore whether the prevailing social organization is truly beneficial for humanity or whether it needs to be rethought and reformed. Quote 153. The only philosophical position which can be recognized in such a conception is the negative doctrine that there really is no philosophy. This quote points out that when philosophy is reduced to serving the practical needs of the current social order, it loses its critical and transformative function. Such a view essentially denies the existence of philosophy as a meaningful, independent discipline, leaving only skepticism and nihilism in its place. True philosophy must go beyond mere practicality and engage with the deeper, more fundamental questions of human existence. Quote 154. The critical theory has never been reducible to specialized economic science. The dependence of politics on the economy has been its object, not its program. This quote emphasizes that critical theory is not simply an economic or political tool, but a comprehensive approach to understanding the broader relationships between economics, politics, and society. It examines how economic forces shape political power and social structures, but its aim is to critique and transform these relationships rather than to provide a formula for managing them. Quote 155. Man must be made to see the relationship between his activities and what is achieved thereby, between his particular existence and the general life of society. This quote stresses the importance of understanding how individual actions are connected to larger social outcomes. Philosophy helps people become aware of the consequences of their behaviors and choices, showing how their everyday lives contribute to and are shaped by the structures of society. It encourages a deeper self-awareness and recognition of one's role within the broader social system. Quote 156. Neither the concepts of science nor the form of social life, neither the prevailing way of thinking nor the prevailing mores should be accepted by custom and practiced uncritically. This quote highlights the critical role philosophy plays in challenging accepted norms. It argues that neither scientific concepts nor social traditions should be accepted without question. Philosophy advocates for critical thinking, urging individuals to re-examine what is often taken for granted and to resist passive conformity to societal conventions. Quote 157. Technological progress has helped to make it even easier to cement old illusions more firmly and to introduce new ones into the minds of men without interference from reason. This quote suggests that despite technological advancements, these developments can reinforce old misconceptions and introduce new ones. Instead of leading to greater enlightenment, technological progress can sometimes deepen ignorance by providing new tools for disseminating misinformation. This highlights the ongoing need for philosophical critique to counterbalance the effects of technology on human thought. Quote 158. Philosophy is the methodical and steadfast attempt to bring reason into the world. This quote defines philosophy as the persistent effort to introduce reason and rationality into human affairs. Philosophy does not simply reflect on abstract ideas, but seeks to apply reason to the problems of the real world, advocating for a rational organization of society that aligns with human dignity and justice. Quote 159. A basic analysis of the content of purely theoretical philosophical doctrines is therefore one of the most interesting tasks of modern research in the history of philosophy. This quote acknowledges the value of examining the underlying social and historical factors that influence philosophical doctrines. It emphasizes that philosophical ideas cannot be fully understood in isolation, but must be analyzed in the context of the social and historical conditions that shaped them. Such an approach reveals the deeper motivations and implications of philosophical theories. Quote 160. Reason exists in the whole system of ideas. in the progression from one idea to another, so that every idea is understood and applied in its true meaning. That is to say, in its meaning within the whole of knowledge. This quote emphasizes that true reason lies in the interconnectedness of ideas. Rather than clinging to isolated concepts, reason involves understanding how each idea fits within a broader system of knowledge. By grasping the relationships between different ideas, one can apply them in their full and proper context, achieving a more holistic and rational understanding of the world. Quote 161. Art, since it became autonomous, has preserved the utopia that evaporated from religion. This quote emphasizes that art, in its modern autonomous form, has taken over the role once held by religion in maintaining a vision of a better, more ideal world. As religion's influence diminished, art became the space where human beings could imagine new possibilities and resist the oppressive realities of society. It holds on to the dream of a utopian world where freedom and creativity can flourish, providing a critical counterpoint to the harshness of everyday existence. Quote 162. Perfect loyalty to principles isolated from the concrete situation makes them turn into their very opposite, and finally results in perfect relativism. This quote critiques the dangers of adhering rigidly to abstract principles without considering the real-world context. When principles are detached from the concrete conditions they are meant to address, they can lose their meaning and effectiveness, leading to a form of relativism where everything becomes equally valid. This undermines the pursuit of truth or justice, as ideals are no longer grounded in reality, but instead become flexible to suit any situation. Quote 163. The real social function of philosophy lies in its criticism of what is prevalent. This quote highlights that philosophy's role is not to simply support existing systems, but to critically examine the dominant ideas and conditions of society. Philosophy serves as a tool to question the norms, values, and practices that people often accept without reflection, revealing contradictions and encouraging individuals to think beyond their immediate circumstances. This critical stance is essential for driving social and intellectual progress. Quote 164. The gradual dissolution of the family, the transformation of personal life into leisure, and of leisure into routines supervised to the last detail, into the pleasures of the ballpark and the movie, the bestseller and the radio, has brought about the disappearance of the inner life. This quote reflects on how modern society, with its increasing emphasis on mass culture and commodified leisure, has eroded the depth of personal and inner life. What was once a space for reflection and personal growth has been replaced by superficial entertainment, designed to distract rather than engage. The result is a loss of individuality and the diminishing of meaningful personal experience. Quote 165. Today, art is no longer communicative. This quote emphasizes the alienation present in contemporary art. In a world dominated by mass media and superficial communication, art has lost its ability to truly connect people. Instead, modern art reflects the isolation and despair of individuals who are cut off from genuine human relationships and meaningful expression. The breakdown of communication in art mirrors the broader social breakdown in real connections between people. Quote 166. Men as they are today understand each other. If they were to cease to understand either themselves or others, if the forms of their communication were to become suspect to them and the natural unnatural, then at least the terrifying dynamic would come to a standstill. This quote suggests that the false sense of mutual understanding in modern society allows harmful social dynamics to continue. If individuals began to question their superficial forms of communication and recognize the unnaturalness of their interactions, it could disrupt the destructive forces at work in society. The quote calls for a deeper awareness of how people communicate and the systems that shape their understanding of themselves and others. Quote 167. In giving downtrodden humans a shocking awareness of their own despair, the work of art professes a freedom which makes them foam at the mouth. This quote illustrates how modern art forces individuals to confront their own alienation and despair. Unlike mass entertainment, which pacifies and distracts, true art reveals the painful truths of existence and offers a glimpse of freedom that society suppresses. This confrontation with reality can provoke discomfort and anger because it challenges the status quo and exposes the deep dissatisfaction people feel with their lives. Quote 168. There are times when faith in the future of mankind can be kept alive only through absolute resistance to the prevailing responses of men. This quote asserts that in moments of crisis, hope for humanity's future can only be preserved by rejecting the dominant attitudes and behaviors of society. When the collective responses of people align with destructive or oppressive systems, true progress requires resisting these norms, even when it means standing in opposition to the majority. Art, as a form of resistance, becomes crucial in keeping the vision of a better future alive. Max Horkheimer's Critical Theory, Selected Essays underscores the essence of critical theory as an instrument for challenging entrenched systems of power and advocating for a just society. By addressing the contradictions within capitalist and authoritarian structures, Horkheimer emphasizes the importance of self-awareness and social responsibility in philosophical inquiry. His analysis of science, culture, and philosophy stresses the necessity of dialectical thought to comprehend and resist forms of oppression embedded in modern society. Ultimately, this collection illuminates critical theory's enduring relevance as a tool for both intellectual and social emancipation, encouraging readers to approach philosophy as an active, transformative practice aimed at achieving true freedom and equity.
Curious to dive into the mind of Max Horkheimer? With StudyLab Pro's Book GPT, it's possible. Ask questions, explore themes, and discover the depths of critical theory selected essays in an entirely new way. Start your conversation now by clicking on our logo. And if you're hungry for more educational content, subscribe to our channel to keep discovering, learning, and growing. Want more than just videos? Click on our logo now to join us on our platform for multiple choice tests, in-depth content, and tools to help you ace your studies. Get started now.